What is up, YouTube? On this video, we're gonna go over the top 5 things that will not work when you finish your LS swap. So let's get to it. For those of you that are new to the channel, I make tech videos and other content on LS swap and other car stuff. And I don't sit around, waste you guys' time, play with my kids or play with my dog. Sorry, Sage. With that being said, let's get to it. So before we get started, this is gonna be the top 5 things that will probably not work. And even though you have your engine hooked up, your wiring harness done, everything's running fine and your car drives, this will be the top 5 things that will not work unless you do special things to make them work. So let's get started with number 5, guys. So number 5 is gonna take us inside the car and to your dash, and that's gonna be your oil pressure gauge. So if your instrument cluster looks like this, well, first off, you have an old ass Chevy truck. But if your gauges look like this, you definitely have some old gauges. And if it looks just like this one here, that means the backside of the gauge might look something like this, which means you have a mechanical gauge. It's okay, guys. It's not the end of the world. That just means behind your gauge, you have some tubing that goes from your gauge straight to your engine block, which means that your gauge actually senses a pressure mechanically through the pressure of the oil getting pushed through this tube and to the back of your gauge. If you're keeping your OEM gauges, there is ways to hook up this gauge to your LS block, but I've seen so many shops that don't even hook it up because they don't know how, or maybe they're just too lazy. So that's why this makes number 5. So next, we're moving on to number 4, and we're still going to stay focused on your instrument cluster. And number 4 is going to be your engine temp gauge. So on your LS engine, you do have a coolant temp sensor, which senses the temperature of the coolant by the computer, and the computer sends this signal over to your instrument cluster on your regular vehicles. But on your older vehicles, it could not use this signal, especially if you're using the older gauges that came with your vehicle. Now, there is ways to hook up your original gauges to your LS engine and read the temperature accurately, but there's so many different ways to do it. I'm not going to cover that here. You could definitely Google it and find it out for your specific vehicle. If you need help with this or any part of your LS swap, definitely subscribe to my Instagram where I help people fix their LS swaps. All right, guys, so now let's move on to number 3. So number 3 is something that you'll find on mostly vehicles that have a manual transmission. So number 3 was more of a way to give the driver more information, and it wasn't something that's really necessary. And in case you haven't figured it out yet, number 3 is going to be your tachometer, or how we say it down south, your tachometer. So as mentioned before, your tachometer just is a reference, and it tells you how fast your engine RPM or revolutions per minute is spinning. So almost all your LS swap computers will read this signal from your crankshaft sensor and then send it over to the computer. And some newer gauges like these Dakota Digital that we picked up from Pro Tool Store will read that signal. But if you're running these older gauges on your vehicle, they will most likely not interpret that signal correctly, so your RPMs will be all over the map. Now, if you're adamant on keeping the original gauges and you want them tacos, there is ways to convert that signal over to a correct signal so your taco gauge can read correctly. But there's different ways of doing it, and there's all kinds of options. So you definitely have to Google that or subscribe to my Instagram, and I'll help you figure it out. All right, guys, so now we're going to move on to number 2 out of the top 5 things that will not work when you do your LS swap. And again, this might not have been an option on every vehicle, especially every classic vehicle, but some of the higher end vehicles did have it, and that's going to be your cruise control. So on some older vehicles, a lot of the stuff was handled by vacuum, including like your AC control units and your cruise control. So that vacuum for your cruise control was hooked up to some diaphragm, which was hooked up directly to your cable on your throttle body or your carburetor. And through some black magic, it was somehow able to keep the vehicle going at the same consistent speed while you're driving down the road. But for some reason, it's a little bit complicated to hook that system up to your LS engine. So whenever you do LS engine swap, you're probably going to lose your cruise control. Just a heads up. But a little bit of good news for those guys that want to keep their cruise control on their older vehicles. And if you're running an LS3 engine or an LS engine with an electronic throttle body, you could definitely buy some stuff from Dakota Digital that'll allow you to keep your cruise control, and you can pick up all these parts from Pro Touring Store. They are one of our oldest sponsors, and they do support the channel. Plus, they are a small business, so make sure you guys check them out, support them, and they even have some of the best prices around. And now, moving on to the number 1 thing that will not work when you do your LS swap, and that's going to be your speedometer. Now, before you guys come at me in the comment section, put your pitchforks down and let me explain. Most people that do their LS swaps will grab their engine, transmission, wiring harness, and computer all from the same vehicle, usually from a junkyard. And this vehicle will usually have an electronic transmission. So these transmissions are controlled electronically, whereas the older transmissions on your vehicle had a mechanical vacuum diaphragm or it had a TV valve that was controlled by a cable. These older transmissions use these inputs to control when your car would shift or how hard it would shift. Either way, both of these style transmissions were not electronic, and also the signal output for the speedometer was a mechanical signal which spun a cable that spun your speedometer in your dash. So if you plan to reuse your original gauges, but you want to use the newer 4-speed electronic transmission, your speedometer is not going to work. So option number one, and probably the cheapest option, would be to reuse your original transmission that's non-electronic and then hook up the right torque converter and the right flex plate to adapt it to your LS engine, and that would keep your speedometer working. And for option two, if you're planning to use a newer electronic transmission, would be to upgrade your instrument cluster gauge set to a newer one that has a digital signal input for your speedometer. Now, this might be a little bit more expensive, but some of the benefits of a newer electronically controlled transmission are you get at least 4 speeds or higher and you have overdrive. Now, since we are talking about transmissions, an honorable mention of something that might not work when you do your LS swap, and that's the transmission itself. So remember earlier when I mentioned that some of these transmissions use a TV cable, a throttle valve cable, to control the shift. So if you're using a newer LS engine with a drive-by-wire throttle body, there's no physical place to attach a cable to pull the throttle valve whenever you accelerate. So if you can't hook up this cable right here, the transmission would not know when to shift, so you end up frying your transmission. Instead, you can switch over to a drive-by cable throttle body, but then you have to figure out a way to, when you hit the gas and the throttle body moves this way, you have to hook up your throttle valve cable to the bottom so that way it pulls the cable when you're giving it gas. All right, guys, so that covers the top 5 things that usually don't work anymore after people do the LS swaps. I even seen some shops do LS swaps and then they still don't hook up everything correctly. So then you have these 5 things not working. If you guys have any questions, comment down below. Or if you have any things that don't work after your LS swap, comment down below. Thanks for watching, guys.